a widowed woman, a crumbling cabin, and a wounded man running from his past. She opened the door just to have her roof fixed. But what he did silenced the entire town. By the way, we noticed something small. Most people who watch these stories aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Maybe we get caught up in the moment or just forget to hit the button. But your support truly helps us keep creating stories like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. The first light of morning barely made its way through the fog. The sky looked like the bruised eyes of a child who had been crying for days, tired and full of sorrow. Louise Kramer was caught between waking and sleeping in her leaky cabin. It wasn't sleep that had kept her down, but the worries gnawing at her all night. Even the last dry log she had thrown into the stove had burned out. The air was damp, even the blanket felt cold. As she tried to warm her hands with her breath, she heard the sound of hooves racing against the wind outside. She froze for a moment, held her breath. The sound of a horse approaching, but no one ever came into town at this hour. She peeked through the curtains. Behind the fogged-up glass that made it hard to see, there was a horse and a man on it. The horse was thin, its ribs almost poking through its skin. The rider looked even worse. No coat, just a torn shirt. Buttons missing, pants muddy at the knees, and boots held together by someone else's rope. His back was hunched, but he still carried a posture of defiant pride. He didn't come to the door. He just stared at the most battered part of the roof, like he was having a silent argument with it. Louise cracked the door open, her voice hoarse. "You fixing it?" she asked. The man slowly turned his head. His eyes were young, but full of stories. He gave a slight nod. "I got no money," Louise added, whispering it like an apology. The man got off his horse. He dragged one foot slightly. If you looked closely, you'd notice he limped. Without a word, he walked over to the wooden ladder and started inspecting the roof. Louise went inside, brought out a rusty box of nails and a hammer. She placed them on the doorstep. "If you fall, I'm not dragging you down," she said. The man nodded his version of a thank you. They didn't talk all day. The man worked barefoot for hours, climbing the broken ladder over and over. As the wind howled through the gaps in the roof, it felt like he was fighting the wind itself. In the afternoon, Louise brought him a weak cup of coffee. No sugar, but it was hot. He took the cup, drank it, and said nothing, just kept working. By nightfall, part of the roof was patched. The man didn't go back to his horse. He curled up in a corner of the barn, on top of hay. No fire, just darkness and the smell of straw. As Louise lit the last piece of coal in the stove, she looked at him through the window. He didn't move. He was either asleep or surrendered to the cold. Something stirred inside her. Not fear, not pity, just a feeling that something had begun. Something dangerous, but unstoppable. The next morning, before Louise even woke up, the man was already on the roof. The sound of nails broke the early silence, echoing like a steady rhythm. Louise brought him a piece of bread and another cup of that weak coffee. He took the coffee and nodded. He still had no name, just his silence, and that silence was starting to take up space in Louise's mind. 2 days later, Louise went into town. She only needed bread and salt, but people were already whispering. The women pursed their lips when they looked at her. The men turned their heads away. The town never forgot things like this. A strange man in a widow's house was more talked about than a fixed roof. When Louise got home, the man was oiling the hinges on the wooden door. No one had asked him to. Louise felt a tremble inside her. Why hadn't he left yet? "What's your name?" she asked. The man turned his head. There was a tired but stubborn light in his eyes. "Samuel," he said, short and clear. Louise nodded. "I'm Louise." That night, the stove was still burning. The sound of water dripping from the roof had stopped. But there was another kind of drip inside, the soft sound of curiosity, of need, of an old loneliness. Louise looked out the window. Samuel was lying in the hay again. But this time, she stayed at the window a little longer, just to hear him breathe. And maybe, in that moment, she realized this wasn't just about fixing a roof. This was about starting over. But would the town allow it? When Louise woke up the next morning, the silence inside the cabin had changed into something else. It wasn't loneliness anymore, not a suffocating emptiness, nor the echo of the past. This silence felt like the first breath of something alive. Outside, the sound of Samuel hammering new planks onto the roof sounded like a morning prayer. Inside, while the coffee boiled, She dried her hands with an old cloth, braided her hair, and stepped out to the doorway. The sun was cautiously peeking through the clouds, casting a bit of color on the gray walls of the cabin. As Samuel hammered another nail, he paused for a moment. He didn't turn his head, but he knew Louise was there. It was the kind of silence shared by people who understand each other without showing it. There was no need to speak, because sometimes the deepest words are the ones never spoken. She left his coffee on the top step of the ladder, then walked to the backyard and started stacking firewood. The order that had rotted away in her lonely months was slowly returning with Samuel's quiet presence. But a question kept gnawing at her. Why was he still here? With all the hunger, fatigue, and wounds, why hadn't he left? Around noon, she noticed a cloud of dust approaching the cabin. Two men on horseback, moving slowly but deliberately. One was stocky, his face cracked like sun-dried leather. The other was younger, but his gaze was sharp, as if measuring something. Louise instinctively quickened her steps. Samuel had seen them too from the edge of the roof and had stopped hammering. He shaded his eyes with his hand and fixed his stare on the riders. "You Louise Kramer?" asked the older one, his voice roughened by tobacco. Louise slowed her steps. "What do you want?" "There's a price to working with strangers," the younger one said. "We don't stay quiet when someone disturbs the peace of this town." Samuel climbed down from the roof. He stood tall, his shirt stuck to him with sweat, his hands still rough with calluses. "If there's a problem, talk to me," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a buried threat in it. "What's your name?" asked the older man. "Samuel Brandt." The man nodded. "Brandt, huh? That name sounds familiar. Someone with a dark past had that name." "The past only leaves a mark," Samuel replied. "But I choose where I go." The tension hung in the air for a moment. The men on horseback turned back to Louise. "We give women a warning first. Let this be the first and the last." Louise didn't respond. She just looked them straight in the eye without flinching. In that moment, her silence was a challenge. When they didn't get an answer, they tugged on the reins and turned back. Behind them, the earth they'd stepped on was left in silence. Samuel stepped closer to Louise. "They know who I am," he said. "And I know who you are too," Louise replied. "You're the one fixing my roof. The one whose hands don't drip with blood." Samuel lowered his head, gave a small laugh, but his eyes shimmered with sadness. "I don't want anything bad to happen to you." "Bad already happened," Louise said, "long before you showed up." That night, Samuel didn't sleep in the barn, he stayed on the porch. As the moonlight filled his eyes, Louise was inside stirring a pot of soup. For the first time, there was a strange warmth inside her. Not loneliness, but something like acceptance. Living despite danger, whispers, and gossip. Maybe that was the most honest way to live. Just before dawn, Louise found a sign left on her doorstep. A black ribbon with a rusty nail stuck through it. It was the silent threat the town used to send to the unwanted years ago. She squinted, picked up the ribbon, and stabbed the nail into the ground. "I won't be afraid anymore," she said to herself. Samuel's voice followed, low but clear. "I'll fight for you, Louise." And in that moment, something more than just wood was being built beneath that roof. This time, it would be tested not by wind but by blood and courage. Louise had left the black ribbon on the nailed doorstep, but her eyes didn't sleep through the night. Every time she heard a sound outside, she held her breath and listened, that old fear crawling back up inside her. In this land, threats were never spoken out loud. Whispers were a sharper weapon. They cut deeper than nails, left longer-lasting wounds than gunpowder. But this time, something inside her felt different. Maybe it was Samuel's quiet presence. Or maybe it was because she had nowhere left to run. She didn't know. In the early hours of the morning, Samuel had found an old hoe behind the barn. He was digging the soil, clearing out the rocks. Louise walked up, surprised. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Preparing the ground," Samuel said. "We can plant vegetables. Potatoes, beans, maybe some corn. Your land still has strength." "Why are you still here?" Louise asked, her voice cracking slightly. "You know your trouble for me. Why don't you leave?" Samuel stood up from where he was crouched. His hands were covered in mud, but he stood tall. "Because I'm tired of running. And this time, I want to know what it feels like to stay." Louise went silent. The hardness on her face didn't fade, but her gaze softened for the first time. 2 days later, there was a fire in town. Not Louise's house, but an old farmer's barn on the outskirts. Still, The gossip like always raced ahead of the truth. "There's been no peace in this town since that stranger showed up," one woman said. "I heard there's blood in his past," said another. Samuel's name had started to spread, but no one had come forward with a direct accusation. That made them more dangerous. When Louise went to the market, the look she received had changed. The town's old grocer no longer said hello. Young girls whispered and giggled behind her back, and one even boldly called her a fallen woman. Louise kept her head high, filled her basket, left her money without a word, and walked away. But inside, she was trembling. This time, not just for herself, but for Samuel too. That evening, Samuel pulled out an old pistol. The barrel was rusty, but the mechanism still worked. "I'm scared," he said quietly to Louise. "Not of you, of what's inside me." Louise stood in front of him. "If that gun enters this house, there's no peace here anymore. Do you understand?" Samuel lowered his head, slipped the pistol back into his pocket, but his eyes had darkened. "One day, they'll want to silence me," he said. "When that day comes, I won't be silent." That night, the wind tore through the silence. There were footsteps around the house. No one knocked on the door, but someone threw stones at the windows. Someone shouted, "Don't forget to pray before bed, Widow Kramer." Louise rushed to the door, but there was no one outside. Just the darkness, and under the moonlight, a cross left on the ground, painted black, with a single word written on it, "Repent." Just before dawn, Samuel took the cross and planted it in the backyard. He nailed a small note under it. Only the sinless ask for repentance. It wasn't a challenge. It was a silent resistance. But the town never forgave silent resistance. 2 days later, another stranger came to town. But this man wasn't quiet, he was loud. In a heavy coat, with a thick mustache and a face that looked like it might explode with rage at any moment, he walked straight into the coffee house. His name was Walter Berger. The town had heard his name years ago, but forgotten his face. But Samuel hadn't forgotten. That man carried a darkness from his past. When Walter said Louise's name out loud, the whole place went silent. "The stranger hiding in that woman's house, he stole my past. I'm looking for him." The next day, Louise found Berger standing at her door. "I told you," Samuel said, his hand on the gun. "This is the past that followed me." Louise turned her eyes to Samuel. "Are you going to run?" "No," said Samuel, his eyes shining. "This time I'm staying. But standing beside me might be dangerous." "Everything is dangerous, Samuel. But this time, we can stand together." And in that moment, it wasn't just nails holding the cabin roof together, it was the fate of two people being fixed into place. But the next step wouldn't just be resistance, it would be survival. When Louise looked into Walter Berger's eyes for the first time, she realized this man wasn't an ordinary enemy. He was a man of the past. The anger he carried wasn't just aimed at Samuel, it felt directed at her too. But there was something worse. Walter knew what he was looking for, and he knew exactly where to find it. That night, Louise didn't light the stove. The air inside was freezing, but the silence outside was even colder. Samuel was sitting on the porch. He held his rusty pistol in his lap, staring into the dark. Louise quietly walked over, laid a blanket on his shoulders. "When did you kill for the first time?" she asked suddenly. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't an accusation, just a plain question. The first step toward facing the truth. Samuel didn't look away. "I was 19. A man riding a stolen horse set fire to a small village at midnight. My sister lived in that village." He paused for a moment, then kept speaking without blinking. "I tracked that man for a year. I finally found him. He smiled at me. I pulled my gun. I didn't even aim. I pressed it to his throat and screamed through his eyes." Louise's chest tightened. She didn't know what to say, but in that moment, she saw Samuel completely for the first time. He wasn't just a stranger, or just a fugitive. He was a man trapped in his own rage, trying to tear down and rebuild with the same hands. "And what about Walter?" she asked softly. Samuel hesitated. Walter was that man's son, just a kid back then. But he saw me. Years later, he found me. He whispered the same sentence every night. "You took my father from me. Now I've come to take you apart." And this time, who's he aiming at? Louise asked. She already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it. Us. By morning, the town was quiet, but it was the calm before the storm. Louise didn't go to the market. She went out to the yard and dug the earth, as if putting down roots would prove to herself that she couldn't run anymore. But in the afternoon, the door of the cabin knocked again. When she opened it, it wasn't Walter, it was the town's priest. He held a rolled-up paper, with a familiar shame on his face. "This is a decision," the priest said, "from the town elders. If Samuel Brandt doesn't leave within 3 days, your rights to this land will be reconsidered. Aid for single women will also be cut." Louise let her arms fall to her sides. "This is my home. My decision." "I know," said the priest, avoiding her eyes. "But their God isn't justice, it's order. And they see Samuel's presence as disorder." Samuel heard the voice and came to the door. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Louise didn't answer. She just took the paper from the priest's hand, crumpled it, and threw it into the stove. As the paper burned, a brief warmth filled the room. But outside, the wind had started to blow harder. That night, Samuel fought with a shadow that came through the dark. Someone had hidden behind the apple tree in the yard, aimed a weapon for a moment, but Samuel was faster. When the gunshot rang out, Louise ran to the window. Someone was lying on the ground in the yard. A young man, barely old enough to grow a mustache. A torch in his hand, a broken rifle at his side. "Do you know him?" Louise asked. Samuel nodded. "One of Walter's men." He wasn't scared, but his hands were shaking. Louise stepped back. "This fight has come to us now. We opened the door, but they brought the fire." Samuel carried the young man to the corner of the barn. "He's not hurt, just dazed. He'll leave in the morning. He came as a stranger, but he won't leave as an enemy." That night, for the first time, Louise curled up beside Samuel. Quietly, cautiously, but willingly. When she rested her head on his shoulder, the storm inside seemed to calm for a moment. But outside, darkness was moving. Walter's eyes were watching their every move. And the next strike wouldn't be a warning, it would be a direct attack. And for the first time, Louise whispered to herself, "You can fix a roof. But if my heart breaks, no one will be able to repair it." That morning, a quiet crowd gathered in the town square. The merchants hadn't opened their shops. No smoke rose from the bakery. The market stalls were empty. Only one voice echoed through the street: "Walter Burgers. A man with blood on his hands is living among us," he shouted, standing on a platform in the center of town. "That man is Samuel Brandt. His past is dark, and there's a woman hiding him. That woman is no longer one of us." People lowered their heads. Some were ashamed, others truly believed what they heard. But all of them stayed silent, because silence had once taken the place of justice on this land. Louise watched it all from behind the window in her cabin. That morning, Samuel hadn't gone up to the roof or done any repairs. There was no sound of nails or digging in the garden. They both knew this was the last calm before the storm. "The town has made its decision," Samuel said, holding his cup of coffee in his hands. "They don't want me here." Louise shook her head. "They don't want me either. But we lived here. We stood our ground here. This is our place now." Samuel lowered his eyes. "You can't build a home on something like my past, Louise. The foundation's rotten." Louise placed her cup on the table. Firmly, "I lived for years with water dripping through the roof. But it wasn't water that fell, it was loneliness. And you were the first to dry it." That afternoon, 4 men from town came, their guns clearly visible on their hips. Whether they came to scare or provoke, it wasn't clear. When they reached the door, one of them raised his voice. "Samuel Brandt, this land doesn't want you. It's been 3 days. You're still here." Samuel stepped outside. He didn't raise his hands, but he didn't reach for his gun either. His eyes weren't on the men, they were on Louise. "What do you want me to do?" he asked simply. Louise took a deep breath, then stepped forward. She stood in front of the men. "This land may not want him, but I do. And this land belongs to me." The men hesitated briefly, because something in Louise's stance had changed. She no longer looked like a widow, she looked like someone ready to fight under the shadow of her own home. But one of them, a man sent by Walter, stepped forward and dropped a large sack on the ground. It was impossible to guess what was inside. Samuel stepped up, opened the sack. Inside were an old, burned photograph, a frame, and a journal. All from years ago. "This is my past," Samuel said. "Walter threw this at me after his father. And yes, I killed his father. But I didn't start that fire. Still, I didn't stop. Because to that boy, I was a ghost who never paid for what I did." Louise stepped forward. She took the photo from Samuel's hand. Her eyes landed on the child's face on the faded paper. Walter. But behind that face, she saw something else. Fear. Loneliness. The same look she once saw in her own reflection. "If this is a blood feud," It'll never end, Louise said. But if we're building a home here, it'll be built on now, not on the past. The men turned to Samuel. Tomorrow morning, they said, either you leave or we'll take you. That night, Louise didn't go inside the cabin. She sat outside with Samuel in the garden. They didn't light a fire, just sat with the warmth of the earth and the fear inside them. Tomorrow, Samuel said, if they take me. Don't resist. Louise turned to him. No, if they take you, this land will lose another roof. And if I'm left alone again, it won't just be the cabin that collapses. I will too. Samuel didn't look away. This is my burden, Louise. And I've shared that burden, Louise said, her voice soft but steady. One person can't fix a roof, but two people can hold up a home. Just before dawn, with the earth still covered in mist, a rider appeared from the town. But this time it wasn't Walter. It was the old town sheriff, now aged and walking with a cane, but his eyes still sharp, who came to the door. I'm here about tomorrow's vote, he said. Vote? Louise asked, surprised. Yes, whether Samuel stays or goes. The final decision belongs to the town, and everyone has one vote. Samuel nodded. It's not fair. The sheriff looked at him. Nothing's ever been fair on this land. But at least this time, your voice will be heard. That day, for the first time in years, Louise ironed her dress. She braided her hair. Samuel buttoned his shirt and wore the jacket he hadn't worn in years. Hand in hand, they walked into town. And this time, it wouldn't be whispers that spoke, it would be decisions. The town's small meeting hall had witnessed weddings, funerals, agreements, and apologies over the years. But that morning, the people lining up outside the door had come to witness something else. A second chance either given or denied to a stranger. Everyone was there. The baker, the teacher, the tailor, the priest. Even old Nora, who hadn't left her house in 3 years, showed up with her cane. Louise and Samuel sat side by side at the back of the hall. They were quiet, but their silence wasn't from fear, it came from determination. Outside, the rain had just stopped. The ground was damp, the air tense. The sheriff entered the hall first. In his hand was a box and blank slips of paper. Then came the priest, followed by the town council. The rule was simple. Everyone would write just one word: stay or leave. But on every face, there was more than just a word, there was the weight of a life. Walter stood alone in the center of the hall, his back straight, his gaze cold. I want justice, he said. This man killed my father. You may have forgotten, but I haven't. Samuel stood up from his seat. He spoke in a calm voice. I haven't forgotten either. But what I remember isn't just the death. What that day left me with is regret. And regret is a burden too heavy to carry. This woman, he said, nodding toward Louise, she carried that burden with me. I don't care if no one else believes me. Her belief taught me how to walk again. The hall fell silent. Everyone walked up to the box one by one. Some had their heads down. Some didn't even look at Samuel as they cast their vote. When Louise took the paper in her hand, she wrote just one word: together. And as she dropped it into the box, her eyes met Samuel's. They smiled. When the voting was over, the sheriff took the box and began to open it in front of everyone. He didn't read them out loud as he counted. He just sorted them. On one side, stay. On the other, leave. Finally, he looked up. Majority says, stay. A murmur spread through the hall. Some nodded, some looked displeased, but no one objected. Except Walter. This isn't justice, he said. This is the cost of forgetting. Louise stood up. This is the cost of forgiveness. You know what your father did. He started the fire. He killed a child. But you only remember that moment through your loss. We're part of something else now, life. Walter paused for a moment. A conflicted anger flickered in his eyes. Then he turned his head and left the hall, leaving behind a past stuck in the mud. That day, Samuel and Louise returned to the cabin. Wild violets had started blooming in the garden. Samuel took off his jacket and dug the soil. We'll plant some onions, he said. Maybe a few tomatoes too. Louise went inside and dropped a handful of unused nails into an old jam jar. Then she placed the jar at the highest point of the roof. If this house ever falls, she said, we'll use those nails to build another one. That evening, the stove was burning. Samuel had brewed tea. Louise opened an old, torn notebook. She wrote a single sentence inside. This is the house of those who are no longer alone. The next morning, the sun rose without clouds for the first time. The first sprouts had started to appear in the garden. Samuel sat on the porch, watching Louise knead dough. "I've never fixed a bakery roof before," he said, laughing. "You started with a roof?" Louise said. "That was the hardest part." The birds sang. The wind was gentle. And for the first time in that house, no sound carried a threat. And years later, if someone ever spoke of that cabin, they would say, "A woman had her roof repaired." But that roof didn't just shield them from the rain, it protected them from the shadow of the past. We're just a few steps away from reaching our first 1,000 subscribers, our growing family. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you to everyone who's brought us this far. With your support, we grow stronger with every story. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time.